Without much ado, may we request the dignitaries on the dais to kindly release the book. May I now request the author, Major General Dr. G.D. Bakshi, SMVSM, to put across salient aspects of his book on the Russia-Ukraine war.
Respected National Security Advisor, Shri Ajit Doval Kirti Chakra, my very dear colleagues, comrades, and friends of long standing, Air Marshal Chopra, General B.K. Sharma, and ladies and gentlemen, there are so many friends I can count in this audience who have die-hard stuck to an old soldier. And today we are gathered here for, I think, something which is of very critical importance to us. Extremely critical importance to us. There are wars that take place everywhere. This is a seminal conflict. 70% of the equipment being employed in this war is what we have as the cutting edge in our infantry. Therefore, the lessons that emerge from this conflict, its outcomes, could not be more vital in import than any other conflict per se. Most conflicts so far in, in the last century, last quarter of the last century, 20th and the beginning of this century, first 2 decades, have been low intensity conflicts, have been asymmetric conflicts, where the two sides were not matched. You see, if the United States invades Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, I mean, it's no match. It's not a symmetric conflict. This is a symmetric conflict. And what makes it worse is that it is being fought by proxy by the entire might of the United States and NATO. And that makes a hell of a lot of difference. You see, if it was a direct clash between Russia and the United States and NATO, the first thing they would have done is shot some spy satellites out of the skies. They would have used their, stealth aircraft to get down some AWACS, get down some J-stars, create holes in the sky through which you then push in an attack. They can't do that. There are 75 military satellites of the United States and the NATO, and about 250 civilian satellites covering that, zone of battle. The levels of transparency, the levels of battlefield transparency are unprecedented. So with that, I'll try and give you a structured, presentation today of the basic contents of the book. I'm starting, if you see on the screen, I'm starting with a set of quotations from some renowned American geopolitical analysts. We start with Henry Kissinger, and he says, it should be settled maxim of American foreign policy never to take on more than one major Asian power at a time. A dictum which the United States seem to be flouting with absolute, unconcern. And then there is George Kennan. Don't forget, he was the father of the containment strategy that did the Soviet Union in. And he said, NATO's eastward expansion would be the most fateful, step of American foreign policy in the post-Cold War. And because it could inflame the nationalistic and Western anti-militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion and restore the atmosphere of the Cold War in the East-West relations. I would also like to point out that he also said the regime in Ukraine was more corrupt than the one in Moscow. And this war could hardly be characterized as one between democracy and an authoritarian regime, which is the prime propaganda line of the United States and NATO in this war. And then we have a gentleman, an American scholar for which I personally have a lot of respect, Professor John Mearsheimer. He said the US and its allies may be able to prevent a Russian victory, but the country, that is Ukraine, will be gravely damaged if not dismembered. There is a serious threat of escalation, not to mention danger of a nuclear war. So I have deliberately prefaced the views of some very critical American scholars who generally carry a lot of heft. The chapterization is on this thing. Could we just have this light off? I think it's not making it very distinct. Thank you. Okay, so the chapterization, we have the prologue. Thank you. What we have started this is with, I'm editor of the Indian Military Review. 2 weeks before the war, we set up on an exercise to war game the conflict. We have been doing it as a policy, magazine policy, publication policy. Every time there is a threat of a conflict, we assemble a team of military, army, navy, air force, and some civilians, and try and war game and try and forecast what that conflict would be like. This forecast of ours was published in the Indian Military Review 3 days before the war actually started, and it was also published in some newspapers, Sunday Standard to be specific, right? And then what we have done is we have compared expected outcomes with actual outcomes to see in our forecasting methodologies where we've gone wrong. And in some cases we were correct. Our analysis was that the aim of the Russians would be to wreck Ukraine, right? And partition it preferably along the Dnieper River, right? So to that extent, we were quite okay. Where we went wrong, and I'm in good company, so did the CIA, so did the Pentagon, so did a whole lot of other organizations, was in the duration of the conflict. Our forecast was 10 days to 2 weeks. The American forecast was a week. And all the javelins, all the stingers given were given for the guerrilla warfare phase. Please don't forget that they had fought a long guerrilla warfare against the Soviet army in Afghanistan. And the Iraqis had been advised by the Russians to not fight conventional. They said, it will be a waste of lives. Fight guerrilla. And you know that the Americans, though they won a brilliant victory, 10 years down the line, they had to go home with a hell of a lot of cost in lives and treasure. So we have done some analysis on this aspect as to how did the whole world get it wrong. And let me at the very outset say it. There is about a decade plus back, the Russians enunciated the General Gerasimov doctrine. General Gerasimov doctrine of the whole of government approach. How they would fight hybrid wars along with information wars, psychological operations, cyber operation attacks, and fight as a cohesive whole to achieve their results, but in a limited fashion. On 24th of February, when the Russians attacked, I'm sorry, the war was no longer hybrid. It was full-scale war because the United States, because Ukraine, because the NATO treated it as such. And this is one of the rare occasions in which the Russians insisted. Putin called it a special operation, and so it was. It's a special operation, period. And there were certain expected outcomes, and Mr. Doval would know this much better than we do, but the fact of the matter is that there seems to have been a major intelligence failure of the order of the Red Orchestra. Now, intelligence specialists would know what the Red Orchestra was. The Soviet Union had deliberately set up a whole orchestra of spy network within the Soviet Union, which were all their people, double agents, and they kept feeding information to the United States and the West, and they created quite a few intelligence disasters. Our personal feeling is that something like this seems to have happened to the Russian human apparatus operating inside Ukraine. The Red Orchestra syndrome seems to have worked. A whole lot of people have been turned around because they couldn't be so wrong. And as I will, elaborate, I will explain. So the second chapter deals with the structural causes of this war and economic warfare. The outcome of this war will very largely be determined by the economic factors. By the economic factors. And they say that history repeats itself. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. And our hypothesis is that why did the Americans so deliberately provoke the Russians to attack? It's almost like poking somebody in the eye again and again and again till he retaliates. Because if the Russians had not retaliated initially, the plan was for the Ukrainians to launch a massive offensive into the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. And with that, they would have involved the NATO. So the Russians decided that before we are attacked and we are on the back foot, let's preempt. Let's preempt. They had left no scope or no margin for the Russians not to react, not to be aggressive, and take the aggressive step. Now here I would once again like to go back a bit in history. My basic subject is military history in my PhD. So take your mind back to Gulf War I. Saddam Hussein called April Gillespie, the United States ambassador to Iraq, and he said, I am going to invade Kuwait. Do the Americans have any objections? Very coyly, April Gillespie, the ambassador, United States ambassador, told Saddam Hussein, we have no opinion on Arab to Arab disputes. Saddam Hussein took it as endorsement, or the Americans would look the other way when he went and did Kuwait in. And the moment he attacked, George Bush the elder said, this will not stand. This is aggression. The entire information warfare playbook was taken out and Saddam Hussein was painted in the vilest of colors. Sounds familiar? This is exactly a repetition of the same theme. You see, Saddam Hussein was trying to take control of the oil price mechanism. Right? The world had just come out of the recession caused by the oil shock of 73. Right? And therefore, they were not keen to let Saddam Hussein now dictate the oil price and raise prices up again. So the whole world ganged up against him. Those who could, the NATO sent their aircraft, their, troops, and Japan, which could not send troops then because of the pacifist conciliation, they paid up. But 850,000 American NATO soldiers were brought together, one of the biggest air power armadas, and after a 42 days air campaign, Saddam was kaput, right? So the design was something quite similar. Our hypothesis is that they wanted an excuse to do to Russia what the Americans had done to the Soviet Union. Let me give you another bit of history. 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed without a single shot being fired. And then they had about 10,000 nuclear warheads. So a nuclear-armed country is flushed down the tube of history without a single bullet being fired, and it splinters into 15 states. That is the end. It just didn't happen on its own. And a lot of people are very fond of saying it happened because of the hemorrhaging in Afghanistan. I'm sorry. The Russians had put in only 5 divisions in Afghanistan. They never increased that force level. To say that they collapsed because of Afghanistan is an absolute misreading of history. I'll tell you how it happened because it merits recalling. You know, the net assessment, Duane Andrews and the others, you know, they carried out an assessment of the you know, the military and economic power, the comprehensive national power of the Soviet Union. They said it is a single product economy based on the sale of petroleum. You get the price of oil down, you can collapse the Soviet Union. Do you know that the oil shock, we all know, 1973, the Arabs did the oil shock. Do you know what happened in 1986? The oil glut. The United States forced Saudi Arabia to flood the world with cheap oil. The price of oil in 6 months fell from $30 a barrel to $10 a barrel. $10 a barrel was the price, incidentally, in the 1930s when Chevron and the others had started their exploration in Saudi Arabia. And it is this which collapsed the Soviet economy. The intention was perhaps to get an excuse to enforce sanctions which had been readied and possibly sink the Russian Federation economically the same way as the Soviet Union had been, you know, driven into a collapse scenario. I'll talk of that a little more later. In chapter 3, we go to the geopolitical precipitating factors, that is the NATO's endless eastward expansion. Don't forget the fact that James Baker, the Secretary of State, had told Gorbachev, not 1 inch eastward expansion. You forget about 1 inch, they took in 3 phases, 14 countries of East Europe were just grabbed and gobbled up and entered into NATO, when actually NATO had no further reason to exist because the Warsaw Pact had folded up. Then in chapter 4, I have carried out a detailed analysis of the force levels, the equipment profiles. We have matched tanks with tanks, artillery, missiles, everything, and the military balance resultant. Chapters 5 and 6, they deal with the operations, phase 1 and phase 2 of the Russians, right? And in this, I have added an appendix for the military scholars where we have done it day by day, formation by formation. We have tried to evaluate the combat performance of almost every formation that took part from the Russian side and from the other side. One of the most important chapters is on information war, psychological operations, and cyber warfare. Here the Americans have won hands down, and this is worth a study in itself. Then we have analyzed the nuclear escalation scenarios and pathways. You know, there are 6,300 warheads with the Russians, the largest number and some of the heaviest warheads. They've been threatening, they've been saber rattling, but not one nuke has been used. You forget use. Not one nuke was moved into firing position. So is there a lesson for us about Pakistan? I do recall that when the last administration was here in Delhi, you know, the theory was that you just take one step into Pakistan and pop goes the weasel. There will be the nuclear smoke and ash all over our heads. I think this war has proved that to be an utter chimera. So the level of risk that we can take, there are lessons for us, and very pertinent lessons. So let's not start frightening ourselves into death with Pakistan's 160 plus warheads. Most of them are between 5, 10 and even less than 1 KT yield. Most are tactical, so nothing to get worried about. Ukraine, biological warfare bridgehead. Will the world enter with a nuclear bang? Will the world enter with a climate collapse? I'm afraid you are more likely to die of a sick whimper. And biological warfare, ladies and gentlemen, let me be straightforward as a military analyst, is a reality. COVID is biological warfare. COVID is biological warfare, and therefore there is a lot that we have to worry about. Economic warfare, I've given it one of the longest chapters. We've got some economic experts to also write for us in this particular thing, because this is the most critical. Then impact and implications for the swing state of India. a comparative analysis of the Bangladesh War 1971 and the Ukraine War. There are studies in contrast. And primarily because we went in after 8 months in which the Mukti Bahini broke the geopolitical balance of Pakistan in the east. And when we went in, it was in the classical Kautilyan paradigm that you break the balance and then you throw an opponent. So we found that we went like a knife through butter. The Russians attacked without breaking that geopolitical military balance. They paid a price. And then, of course, lessons learned in the Indian context. Today, I will not be covering the rest of it. I will primarily be focusing on the lessons, and the epilogue I talk of the onset of multipolarity. May I remind everybody here, very august audience, that before World War I, there was a multipolar world order in place. Before World War II, there was a multipolar world order in place. Today, there is again an emergent, pretty strong multipolar world order, and we are likely to see more conflict rather than this being a one-off conflict again. A quick look at the map to just fix that's Kharkiv, the old capital, that is Luhansk on top, and Donetsk, the two, oblasts which are Russian predominant and which are the richest in minerals. So they have got the whole of Luhansk, they've got about 65% of Donetsk, they are now fighting in Bakhmut. Mariupol is the link, the land corridor to Crimea. They had captured Kherson. Now they have, I think a lot of people are trying to make it into a defeat, but I think it's a very rational military decision to have your boundaries resting on major rivers. The Dnieper is a major river, so they have been very cold about it, and they have come from the other side. So about 80% of Ukraine's coastline on the Azov and the Black Sea has been taken by the Russians. They have only one port left, which is Odessa, and Odessa is under siege. Next, please. Next, please. Now, a few salient aspects that have emerged. The sheer intensity, the scale, and the duration of the Russia-Ukraine war marks a significant paradigm shift in the very nature of war fighting. It marks a dramatic shift away from low-intensity conflict and asymmetric wars. Future wars are likely to be more symmetric, and then they will be like 1965 war, they will be like 1973 Arab-Israeli war, they'll be like the invasion of Lebanon, 1983, hard-fought slogs. In the dynamic between offense and defense, between tank and anti-tank weapons, between aircraft and air defense systems, we are seeing a new equilibrium that clearly favors defense over offense. The defender will always have an advantage. Heavy and medium artillery, I think the prime lesson from the Indian context, heavy and medium artillery has once again become the critical war-winning factor, just as it was in the two world wars. Next, please. Over 3,600 tactical ballistic cruise and hypersonic missiles have been fired by Russia alone in this war. I'm not counting what the Ukrainians have fired. The resultant scale of casualties and carnage have simply been unprecedented in our time. The Pentagon just mentioned estimates of a lakh of casualties, killed, wounded, on both sides. So that's 2 lakh people, who have died or been severely wounded. This is amazing. We just had about 6,000 odd casualties in the highest is in the 71 war, eastern and western sectors both put together. So you can just imagine the scale of casualties that have occurred. Most military analysts feel we are witnessing a pivotal moment in military history, the reascendance of defense as the decisive form of war. So anybody who's smart will try and make you, normally it was thought seize the initiative, attack first, and dominate him from the word go. The American doctrinal thinking that we are watching is a marked shift. Why did they start needling China? It makes absolute strategic nonsense to take on the Russians and the Chinese at the same time, because the Chinese have to attack over 80 miles of the sea. And knowing the, the lethality of defense, they would be made to pay a very heavy price. So it would be in your interest to induce the other side to come first. Take a bloody nose and then you can go on. Given the scale of casualties, we will have to focus hard on force preservation, reconstitution of badly battered units, and quick replacement of casualties in future wars. Units will get wiped out, two-thirds casualties down, horse-day combat, and therefore wars will henceforth be a test of national will and stamina to stay the course. You see, it was said that this is the era of short duration, high intensity conflict. No war can last very long because it would cross the nuclear threshold. I'm sorry, 10th month and counting, and we anticipate the next year plus, at least, this war will continue on in spurts. So the clear lesson is this is the most inopportune time to downsize or reduce numbers. Very dangerous. World over defense budgets are rising and very fast. Germany is going to spend $100 billion in the next 5 years to catch up on its defense armament and force levels. Japanese are likewise, doing the whole of Europe. They have been set a target of 3% of the GDP to be spent on defense. So this is not just the era of high tech, but high tech and mass. This is what it was by the end of World War II. Look at the Russian campaigns. When Marshal Zhukov and Koinev were going for Berlin. High-tech and mass, they had lined their artillery guns wheel to wheel. We have our guns separate. They were wheel-to-wheel artillery, and with their artillery, they pounded, brought Berlin down to rubble. They reached the Hitler's Führer bunker, Wolfschanze, and Hitler committed suicide. And that is the level to which this war was fought. Nations that want to win in such unrelenting wars will need to generate the mass required to prevail in such intense and long duration grinds of attrition. Wars, like I said, will increasingly be a test of national will and stamina to stay the course. Ukraine's ability to not just exist but persist is what has, shaken up the rest of the world. Both Russia and Ukraine, even as they are fighting, are feverishly raising and training new formations, even as they are locked in brutal combat. Therefore, downsizing a standing field force in such a dire scenario could be very dangerous, extremely dangerous. We are witnessing the return of the era of von Clausewitz, General von Clausewitz, and today the world is witnessing the sheer cost nations are willing to endure to attain their objectives and simply prevail in such hard-fought slogs of attrition, not only the era of high-tech, but high-tech and mass. I repeat that. 70% of our equipment, as I said, is Russian, and therefore there is a dire need to study and ingest the lessons of this campaign, and we couldn't wait. I was told that why don't you hang on till this war is over? I said it could take 2 to 3 years. It may be late for us then to ingest lessons. Perhaps the lessons of the economic war and the information and cyber war domains are as vital as the lessons of the kinetic war. So I might just mention a word in passing about information war and cyber war and psyops. There are 3 domains: international, regional, global. You find the Russians and the Chinese have hived off their local domains from any penetration from outside. I mean, no Twitter, no Facebook, etc. goes there. They have their own. And they are able to firewall the entire information deluge that is being put. They are able to save their populations or, prevent their populations from being shaken up by the propaganda assaults. This is where we have a major lesson to learn. The Americans and the British and the NATO, because of the English language, there this thing is far easier in the regional and international level. Now we have skyrocketing energy, food and fertilizer prices. The world is staring at a deep recession and stagflation. The longer it lasts, the more we all will suffer. It's in the world's interest to see that this ends. But I'm afraid we can all do very little. We are just hapless bystanders by and large. India had an army, this is very interesting. India had an army modeled on the lines of World War II era armies. Don't forget that in the Second World War, we had an army of 2.5 million all volunteer. It was the largest all volunteer army in the world. By the time the British went, they reduced it to 3,50,000, divided it between India and Pakistan. Now, just one second. Back, please. So we had an army model on the lines of World War II. There was a lot of effort put to try and modernize this army and get it out of the World War II mold. And now that we really got onto it, especially with the coming of the current administration, I'm sorry the world has gone back to World War II. This is something that as a military historian we need to ponder over. Next please. This is the one operational research statistical analysis slide that tells you everything you want to learn about the lessons of this war. Now, this is being done by the Austrian army. They studied for the last 7 years the fighting in Donbass, that is in Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast, which have been taking place from 2014 onwards. And now on the left side are the type of weapon systems, and on the right are the percentage of casualties they have inflicted on tanks, artillery systems and vehicles. Now if you will notice, artillery, which is in red, 45% of the tanks destroyed are by medium guns, right? 65% of the artillery, counter battery, guns destroyed are by medium guns. And 57% of the vehicles are again by medium guns. Another thing that took a lot of, casualties is these people sneaking in and putting in IDs. So you find that 13% tanks by IDs and 29% vehicles by IDs. The javelins, all the Panzerfaust, etc., all the anti-tank guided missiles, so much has been made in the media. Such a media offensive on the javelin, my God, single silver bullet that won the war by itself. The figures are there, 13% tanks destroyed, 15% vehicles. Tank to tank fighting, 14% tanks have been destroyed by our tanks. And then the RPG, shoulder fired weapons, 9%. So this tells you to look beyond, the post-truth, the hype, the media inflation. And look at, because otherwise you will be putting in a lot of money in the wrong place. So it was essential to see this operational research statistical based analysis, which is factual. This is a quick bean count of the equipment that was there on both sides. The only point is you see Russia 12,000 tanks and 30,000 ICBs, APCs. This includes all their reserves. Not all of these have been committed, just about a fraction of these have been committed in Ukraine. The levels of tanks, etc., were more or less equally matched with, slight weight on the Russian side. Artillery, the Russians had 10 times. They had 10 times. Next, please. And inflated estimate of casualties. Very interesting slide. This was on the briefing in May by the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. So we have got the figures of soldiers killed, soldiers wounded. Take a look at the figures of the tanks and the armored vehicles, the jet fighters. On the left in the black are those which were claimed on the left side by the Ukrainian, right side by the Russians. In red are the satellite imagery, Maxar. They picked up every single tank carcass. They picked up every single downed aircraft wreckage. And then when you count, you see the Ukrainians have claimed 1,110 tanks. Actual carcasses are 408, 400 plus, right? Armored vehicle 2,600 plus 750. Jet fighters 191, 20. So you see that there is a hell of a lot of inflation, a hell of a lot of inflation and exaggeration. Next, please. Now let's go on to the conduct of the fighting per se. What was the primary interest of the Russians in Ukraine? These were the oblasts of Luhansk and Donetsk, which are primarily 35% plus Russian speaking. These are also the richest in minerals, richest in minerals in the whole of Europe. You don't have a richer belt. So the Russians wanted this, and you see that portion with diagonal lines is what, by hybrid warfare, the Wagner and the other groups, they had, pretended to be insurgents, gone in and they had taken that. And that red line is the line of contact, LOC. Now on both sides of the line of contact, Maginot lines have been built up. You know, 3 tiers, both the Russians and the Ukrainians use 3 tiers of trenches. Every village, every town has been fortified. And right now there are about 5 brigades fighting in Bakhmut. 5 brigades, this is the largest single concentration of Ukrainian forces anywhere in Ukraine. Next, please. And this, of course, so if you had to go for Donetsk and Luhansk, quite obviously, if you went frontally, you would pay a heavy price. So you had to advance on multiple axes to divide the enemy reaction, to take some of the forces, dilute them opposite Donetsk, Luhansk. And now we will quickly go over how this is the Russian lineup of forces on 5th of February, right? And this is the Russian lineup of forces. Sorry. Just say wonderful. I'm sorry, please carry on. So this is the Russian lineup of forces on the 5th of February, and you find that there was a situation similar to Parakram, right? There was a situation similar to Parakram. Ki will they, won't they? And do you know that the German intelligence chief was caught in Kyiv when the attack came. Despite all the hoopla that we know when the attack is going to coming, this is the date of the attack, they were caught by surprise. The French intelligence chief was sacked for not being able to predict that they would attack. So that is the Russian lineup of forces, 11 combined armies, which is their corps. Next, please. This is, of course, in blue are the Ukrainian 14 armored brigades, 14 brigades, armored infantry, airborne, etc. they started with. Next, please. And this is the initial attack, multi-pronged attack. You find that the initial attacks were on Kyiv and Kharkiv, the old capital. Then, of course, in Luhansk, they attacked, and Donetsk. And the 58th Russian army and another Russian army and the Marines, they attacked in the south. The best progress was made in the south. You know, because there was an idea fixe in the Russian army that they will just fold up like they folded up in Ukraine. There will be no fight. We will be welcomed as liberators and as heroes. We'll be welcomed as liberators and as heroes. So they were anticipating to be just like we had gone into Dhaka and the most tumultuous welcome we had received. Now this one was, the biggest shock that they got was there. Putin had given instructions. Artillery is not to be used, heavy artillery especially, right? The people, no collateral damage. The only person who ignored this was the army commander in the south. And you find the best progress made in the south. So sometimes, it pays not to get too bogged down by orders. Let the man on the ground decide. The Russians did not use artillery, the Ukrainians did, and they decimated the attacks on Kyiv. Now what had happened was that they, on the very first day, they had their SEAD campaign of just 1 day. Like I said, in Gulf War I, SEAD campaign was 42 days. In Yugoslavia, it was 82 days of, just bombing, degrading their defenses and SEAD operations. Here it was just 1 day. Now this is amazing as to why the Russian Air Force was superior. I would request the Air Marshal to certainly tackle this aspect. So on the very first day, they did an air assault operation on the Hostomel airfield. 30 plus, Mi-17s landed there along with the Hokums and the others. Now, normally when you seize an airhead, then you expand the airhead so that you clear all stingers and shoulder-fired weapons from that airfield, and then you hold it till a link up with the armored forces. In this case, they landed. They didn't bother to really secure the Hostomel airfield. They attacked Kyiv, and they took extremely heavy casualties. Some of the best Russian troops suffered in a very, very serious way. And don't forget that on the first day itself, Putin had said, surrender. So it was planned at the highest level. It was not just a local initiative. So when that air assault failed, then they advanced on, Kyiv from these multiple 5 directions, right? And in these 5 directions, they had about 5 armies on each thrust line, and they surrounded Kyiv. And now they thought that they would do a siege and bombardment, and not really go in for attack. Next, please. And this is in the south, like I said, they did the best. They linked up at Mariupol. We all know of the fighting. I will leave the details out. They are all available in the book. But here they secured 80% of the coastline of Ukraine. That means the GDP of Ukraine has been hit by 40 to 50%. It is down. They have just one port left, which is also under siege at Odessa. Next, please. Now, in phase one, when they found that they couldn't capture Kyiv, they decided to pull out their troops from Kyiv and Kharkiv and now focus on Donbass, right? And the initial plan was to have a wider encirclement, right? But they were able to pull out without the Ukrainians contesting. And I will explain to you how this subsequently had a bit of a problem in the closing phases. Next, please. This is Severodonetsk. The bitterest fighting has taken place here. 50,000 rounds of artillery per day, which translates into 2,500 tons of ammunition being moved every day. They pounded this place to rubble, and then they captured it. Then they went for Lysychansk. There was a brigade plus in Severodonetsk. Lysychansk is on higher ground. It had 3 brigades, but they then surrounded it from 3 sides. So to avoid being encircled and destroyed, they vacated Lysychansk. And then they had a tactical pause. Next, please. Now the Ukrainians began to advertise. Every single Ukrainian piece of equipment with which they started the war has by and large been destroyed. All Russian category tanks, all Russian category guns, by and large destroyed. But they, Americans and the NATO rebuilt. They created 5 new brigades with which they attacked in the area of Kherson. Initially, they took very heavy losses in there, but the Russians, to now contain this attack, they stopped the attack in Donbass. They pulled out 30,000 troops and they put them here. Now, 30,000 troops were not adequate because of much larger force level coming this way. And the problem was the Americans used the HIMARS to knock out all bridges on the Dnieper River. Now supplies became a problem. So the Russians very sensibly decided, let's not get into prestige. The line of the Dnieper is the best. It still does not allow Ukraine to use the port of Kherson, because unless you clear the other side of the river, you can't use that port. So a lot of people said, oh, they've lost face, they've lost, etc. Nothing of the sort. Next, please. So, Ukraine war, lessons learned, military demographics. There is no dearth of Russia has no dearth of military equipment. Yet, they have a shortage of manpower, and it has shown painfully. The first time in history we were taught normally in our academies that to attack you need a ratio of 3:1. If there's a platoon, you attack with a company. If there's a company, attack with a battalion. 3:1. Here, the defender is 250,000 to start with. The attacker is 150,000. And imagine he's been fighting for 10 months more or less with the same force level. People thought that he would order a full-length mobilization, but that did not happen. And the fact of the matter is, it is only now that he has called up 3 lakh reservists. So the options were that he could either attack in winter or he would wait till spring and then launch the major offensive back. Looks like he's planned on spring, because he has to give his people some rest. Just like in Kargil, we were shuttling forces from here to there. You attacked here, 13 Jack, 5140, then they were taken out and they were used in Mashko Valley, and then troops that had attacked twice, thrice. Recycling troops tires out troops, and there is a very nice saying, exhaustion makes cowards out of us all. The best of troops at a point in time will start cracking down. This is where the Russians then really pressed and they were able to, force Putin to order mobilization. Medium artillery, war winning factor. When I was in the MO Directorate, we had started mediumization of the artillery. I'm talking of 1999, 2000, 2001. It's still not being done. But thank God, we are now producing our own medium guns. The ATAGS is one of the finest guns in the world. So is the tank dead? There is again a thing here, the tank is finished, drones will knock it out. Sorry, the tank will very much be around for a very long time. Only thing is we have 60% of our tanks are T-72s and the ammunition is all stored in the turret. So when the tank is hit, the gases build up and the turret goes about 50 to 100 meters high in the sky, right? So the next is the fact of the underutilization of air power. The Russian Air Force was many times stronger than the Ukrainian. Yet the sortie generation rate is 250 to 300 sorties per day. Gulf War I, it was 1600 sorties per day. Yugoslavia, it was 600 plus sorties per day. In 1971, our own Air Force had done 460 sorties per day. So this is not understood. Why this low sortie generation rate? Right? Battlefield transparency and situational awareness. Look, you see, with these satellites watching every move, in the Kharkiv sector, after the attack in Kherson, the Russians said, let's resume the attack in Donbass. So they decided to pull out troops from the Kharkiv sector, right? The satellites picked it up. And this time, the Americans told the Ukrainians, charge. ये लोग पीछे हट रहे हैं Oskil River पे. So as the Russians were withdrawing, these people charged, and you had that spectacle of the Russian charge really going through like, knife through butter kind of a thing. But the Russians were as it is pulling out. So the optical illusion was of a disaster. That is the time Russia was really stung and they mobilized, and now they have stabilized the situation. Nuclear threat, like I said, how potent is this threat? Meteorological factors. Don't forget that in the year of the Lord 71, Madam had asked Sam to go in the month of March, when the first crackdown took place in Bangladesh. And Sam said, Madam, you order me to go in, I will go in, but I cannot promise you victory. You let me go in the month of November, December, 100% assurance of victory. She said, why? He said, the monsoons will be over, the ground would have hardened, the clouds would have gone, the Air Force would be able to support me, the passes of the Himalayas would have closed, right? And then there is the aspect of their campaign season is actually June, July. But they had to go in the month of February because the Russians say that we just couldn't help it. If we had not gone in, they would have gone in. So we had to ignore the Met factors, but they cost them quite a bit, especially in the Battle of Kiev. A lot of tanks bogged out. They had to move only on roads, and by virtue of moving on roads, they were totally predictable. 71, we had gone in for the command and control target of Dhaka. We had pinpoint bombed, the Air Force had pinpoint bombed the conference of the governor and Niazi. And Niazi had ducked under the table and started sobbing like a baby. And, the governor had from under the table signed, I hereby resign. That was the effect of just 4 MiG-21 firing rocket pods. And then it was attacked again. And that is what made him surrender. Here we found that initially we were told Kyiv is the target. But when they failed to take Kyiv, they just took off all attention from Kyiv. And Kyiv became a tourist capital. Every leader in the West wanted to show his face there and get himself photographed. You can't leave a capital command and control center like this. This is, I think, one of the major flaws on the Russian side. I'd request the Air Marshal to talk on military aircraft versus missiles and drones. And lastly, as I mentioned, hybrid war plus full-scale war. The last slide, next please. Economic war. Like I said, this will be crucial. Russia was ready because they knew sanctions would come. They had built up a war chest of $630 billion. 300 were parked in American and European banks, right? And they just grabbed them. The lesson learned is, can India, can China afford to put our money in American banks? That globalization trust is gone. The Russians then made a master stroke. They asked all countries, you will pay for your gas and oil in dollars. Gas and oil in dollars, right? Capital controls, they stopped all movement out of money from their country. And then, of course, they increased the interest rate. And like I said, seems to be a deliberate design by the Americans to target the Russian economy and collapse Russia like they had collapsed Soviet Union. But it has failed. The people who have suffered the worst are the Europeans. America has also suffered, but France, Germany, their economies are going to be hit. And this winter is going to be a terrible winter for Ukraine, for the whole of Europe, especially France, Germany, UK, etc. So don't plan for a trip there. Thank you very much for your patience listening.
May I now request Air Marshal Chopra, PVSM, AVSM, VM, VSM, Director Center for Air Power Studies to give his views. He is a renowned fighter pilot and test pilot, a great exponent of air power, and has 6 books and 700 papers to his credit. Sir.
Thank you so very much, and heartiest congratulations to my dear friend General Bakshi, very prolific writer, analyst, a very enthusiastic, passionate person on television. The whole country loves him. The whole country watches him. The whole country listens to him. He's written a great book. The first book out in the market, as he said that despite people saying, why don't you wait, he thought he must. And we have literally heard the entire book being covered in the last 1 hour or so. So I have gone through the book and lots of facts and figures. Of course, some of them will get revised as the time goes by. Must remember that this is a war between 2 largest nations of Europe. Ukraine is second largest in size, and huge asymmetry between them. You know, what is the kind of asymmetry, for example, air power, because he's covered a lot about tanks and artillery, and I must mention in air power, 3,800 aircraft with the Russians, 300 aircraft Ukrainians, and in fighters, 200 fighters, 100 fighters with Ukraine, and 1,700 fighters with the Russians. And Russians 8 squadrons of bombers, including supersonic bombers. So the firepower in the air that is with the Russians, phenomenally more. But people are questioning, did they do SEAD enough? Did they bring in the air power? You know, I've been in Russia for 4.5 years. I've been in Ukraine many times, and I have watched the Russians, understood how they operate. I've been in touch with the Russian attaché, the Hungarian, the Polish, the various. They've been coming to meet me and update us what's happening from their point of view. And I must tell you that, of course, Russians decided that they will not commit. At any given time in that region, there are around 300 fighter aircraft from the Russian side. Of course, they can be replaced, more can come in. What is that? Whether they have done etiquettes yet? Firstly, remember that Russians have been preparing for this war for nearly 2 years. After 2019, when Zelensky said that there is irreversible, in the constitution he brought in the irreversible, for them, they will join NATO and EU. It's in the constitution. It was an amendment passed in 2019. So the Russians had started preparing, they had started warning, they have been telling the West. So for them to not know the battle of it will be unrealistic. They have got satellites, they have got so many other means. They were the first to reach the space. They've got everything. So therefore, first thing is that be sure that they knew order of battle. Second, the war has lingered on, 285th day today. But I must tell you, this is not the first war which has lingered on. We know what happened in Korea. After 3 years between 2 very powerful people, stalemate. Vietnam, 15 years. We all know what's happened in Afghanistan. 20 years with no opposition, just some terrorist groups. So wars can take time. Afghanistan, even the Russians got bogged down. So therefore, wars take time, and we all must be aware that things are not going to, the wars are not going to finish quickly. SIAD. What is the requirement of SIAD? Is to neutralize all air opposition, which means ground fields and aircraft. So what did they do? Out of the 100 fighters, 50 fighters of the Ukrainians were destroyed. 40 of them on the ground, 10 of them in the air engagements. It was a bad idea for both the sides to do air engagements. Both lost aircraft in the air, but small numbers. But Ukrainians lost 40 out of the 50 fighters on the ground. Russians lost 40 to the air defenses. Now, to knock off, to do SIAD against air defenses is a different ball game. Yes, if you have to knock off the radar of the S-300 or some system like that, SIAD is required. But to do SIAD against shoulder-fired missiles, not possible. He can carry it. It's mobile. It's shoulder-fired. He can be hiding under a bush. He could be hiding anywhere. So therefore, the requirement of SIAD was different. But what was actually done, a new term has come, air denial. Both sides have achieved air denial. Ukrainians, by not letting the Russian fighters, why will Russians come and expose their fighters to shoulder-fired missiles or the leftover S-300s? And now NSA, MSA, and other systems with the Americans have given now Stingers, 1,000 Stingers. They got subsequently another 2,000 of them. So a large number of Stingers have come in. So they could deny. Russians intentionally did not bring aeroplanes because they lost some in the beginning. So that is so air denial. But the Russians have also denied air. There is no aircraft flying from the Ukrainian side at all in whole of Ukraine, because the remaining 50 fighters have been moved away to the western airfields or outside Ukraine. So this is as far as the air war between fighters is concerned. Second part about fighters is strikes. General Bakshi in his book has mentioned some number of cruise missiles, PGMs that were used. One hell of a lot of cruise missiles have been used. Did they help achieve military objectives? Were they help political objectives? Was it to scare the people of Ukraine by firing at some of their targets? Then they used 3 hypersonic missiles, just to symbolic, just to tell the world, okay, first time somebody using a hypersonic missile in a combat condition. But why would, if somebody used a hypersonic missile against a static target with no value otherwise, because that can be knocked off by a conventional ballistic missile with a conventional warhead. Much cheaper to do it. But symbolism that, okay, I have got hypersonic missiles, so I have used it. The cruise missiles have had their impact. You may like it or not. Certainly, Moscow, cruise missiles. 2 cruise missiles have knocked off a ship. I think a technical mistake by the Russians to have a ship so close to the shore that ground-based cruise missile, just 2 of them. In actual case, a large ship, if we were to go to battle tomorrow, you will launch 10 cruise missiles. Because one big ship getting, imagine an aircraft carrier, somebody launches 30 cruise missiles. Because that aircraft carrier is going is crucial. So this is a lesson for us to learn that cruise missiles are in fact with just 2 of them, they could knock off a Moscow, the largest cruiser knocked off after the Second World War. Drones. Large drones have been in the past used only in uncontested environment, in Afghanistan, Iraq and all. But of course, there was contested environment in the Azerbaijan, war. But now there was contest. Initially, the Russians were not using, the Ukrainians were using these TB2s, the Turkish TB2s. They was supposedly getting some, but soon they started getting shot down. Finally, 50 TB2s got shot down. Russia brought in Orions. They also started getting shot down. Both withdrew these conventional UAVs. But what came in is small drones, kamikaze drones. Now, kamikaze drones have done damage, knocked off tanks, because mostly the tanks were earlier, catered for, the armor part was not so much from the top, the protection wasn't there. So the drones have done their needful. So the general has said tank is very much there. So is the large ship. But there are vulnerabilities that we need to address for both the tank and the drones are very much there. $6,000 is all that the drone costs. Autonomous drone. He will go and hit targets, even if he knocks up a soft skin vehicle of the army. So drone is here, and drones is what the whole country in India, right up to Prime Minister, is talking drones, drones, drones today, because drone is going to make a difference. The cost is very, very cost effective. Air defense missiles, very important. You know, we bought the S-400, but we require much, much larger numbers of smaller missiles. The inventories have to build up. We've seen the way the war is going on. India has to invest in, we have to a huge stocking of BrahMos and other cruise missiles the country will have to have. So there are areas on which lessons are to be drawn. Force levels. General Bakshi is mentioned in his book, force levels, for Army, Navy, Air Force. Force levels have to go up. You know, we are not going to get into whether the Army needs more money, the Air Force needs, Navy needs, whether aircraft carriers required by them or not required. Separate issue. But what is required is we need to invest. You know, in Europe, firstly, let me, before I come to this investment part, I must briefly mention that, you know, any war is bad. People die, properties are lost, homes are broken. And in Ukraine, why the war has started, General Bakshi mentioned, but I must add one sentence to that. American military industrial complex is always looking for somebody to punish. When they left Afghanistan, we hoped that they will concentrate on Indo-Pacific, but for some reason, and the reason I will tell you now, they went to Europe. So they want the military industrial complex knows the Chinese will buy nothing from them. Of course, Indians will buy something from them. The only other guys who can buy is Europeans, only if they can be made insecure. That you can create an environment where the Europeans after Second World War will be seeing the first war, the full-fledged war. So the American military complex, the President of America in 1960, Eisenhower, has said that the democracy in America is controlled by military industrial complex. And that is what has happened. So the losers, Ukraine, total loss. Lives, families, property, everything, economy. Europeans, losers. Why? The energy source, they had good linkages with Russia, gone. They're losers because their defense budgets will have to go up. They're already going up. They will have to buy more arms from whom? From the Americans, because NATO standardization is there, so they'll go. Russians, losers in the long term, because their economy will get affected, they will be under pressure for some years to come for them to recover. Of course, they've got unlimited natural resources, but they will be losers. Gainers, what happens to Chinese? No, I'm not sure they're gainers. They're all watching. For China, it's not a good idea for Russia to be a weak country. They want somebody to neutralize NATO, keep them engaged. It's not in China's interest to have Russia being dictated by NATO. So Chinese are also not gainers. What about India and so many other countries? We are wait and watch. We are feeling sorry for both the sides. They are cousins and brothers, with Ukrainians and Russians, and both were important to us. And here I come in, what happens to the spare parts? The general mentioned that 70% of armed forces are from Russia. And some of it was Ukraine. Our AN-32 comes from Ukraine. I felt very sorry that AN-225, the single piece, largest aircraft ever built, got knocked off in a crossfire between the two countries. One felt, as an aviator, I felt very hurt. So there are spare part issues. Our basket with Russians is big. They have been great friends for long. They have supported us critical time, but India has to have this basket to open up. We already have acquired some American stuff. We've got the French aeroplanes, our basket. But the biggest thing in our basket has to be Atmanirbharta. I think it's so critical that you must build your own aeroplanes, your own weapons. Indigenization has to go up. The government is very clear. The country is moving towards that. And I think that is one area where we need to sort of, push in terms of, Atmanirbharta. And Just let me see if I've left anything. Nuclear deterrence. Yes, you wanted me to speak very briefly about nuclear deterrence. Yes. Escalate to de-escalate. The Russian escalate to de-escalate strategy has been written by Putin when he was a young official. It's there. So they have used. Uh, will nuclear weapon will be used there? I don't think so. It will not. It's a taboo. Nobody will use it. You cannot lose Moscow for launching a nuclear weapon. It's not a joke. And you ever think that Pakistan, he mentioned greatly because he's a specialist on Pakistan. He mentioned that, Pakistan, tell me one general who, or a politician in Pakistan, all of them are rich, flushed with money, who got stuff lying all over the world, in America and Middle East, their money is parked there. Are they going to lose the acres and acres of property each one owns by firing a nuclear missile at us and thereafter getting knocked off themselves? No, they're having good days. They're having a good time. Nobody's going to kill their own good time by firing a nuclear missile. So this is all nonsense. They'll use a TNWX will do. Putin will never use a nuclear weapon. I think we are all countries are very mature. Even in Pakistan, I must tell you, they are very mature when it comes to nuclear weapons. We may keep saying anything about them, otherwise. So I think this nuclear thing is not to get worried. And I keep telling, the audiences all over that this is something that you need to not get worried. I'm not going to take too much of time because General spoke for a very long time and he'd asked me to speak for 20 minutes. So I think I've spoken, and if there'll be some questions in the end, I'll speak. Over to you, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. May I now request Major General B.K. Sharma, AVSM SM Bar, Director USI, to kindly give his views. General Sharma has done yeoman service by popularizing the net assessment methodology in the Indian Armed Forces. Very widely traveled, he has recently returned from Russia and is very well placed to talk on this subject. Sir.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I just want to place my gratitude on record for General Bakshi, who's been my teacher at the National Defense College, to give me this opportunity to share platform with another senior officer, that is Air Marshal Chopra, who's very well known to me. What I wish to do is I wish to compliment General Bakshi for the timings, theme, mapping, content, relevance, utility of this book. And I think he's actually put in so much of effort that, rather than you reading whole lot of articles left, right, and center, he's put in that hard work, and whatever is happening till now, he's encapsulated this in this single book. And what is more important here, that he's been able to correlate certain past historical experiences, contextualize that to the context which is unfolding, and then drawn certain lessons out of that. And I would particularly like to sort of compliment his very deft handling of the military balance, wherein he's looked at the doctrines, the force levels, and campaign strategies of the two sides. And then he's, after, seamlessly stitching these chapters together, he's gone to comparison with the 1971 war, implications for India, and the largest lessons learned at large. Now, I have been studying this subject and speaking at different fora from time to time. What are the takeaways from this book for me, which I would like to share? And I would also request you to concurrently compare what I'm going to say with an Indian situation here, an Indian scenario. And the first and foremost thing is the strategic geography of a nation. If you look at the strategic geography of Russia, there are two major dilemmas it faces. One is the dilemma of the seas, that it is virtually a landlocked country with huge mass, and if it wants to reach out to the whole world, to the north it has Baltic Sea, and through the North Baltic Sea it goes to the northern seas and then goes to the Arctic region, which is very, very rich in its resources. The second is Black Sea and Sea of Azov, and through that it gets an entry through Bosphorus into the Mediterranean Sea and into the Indian Ocean. This is one major strategic dilemma. The second strategic dilemma is the Carpathian Gap, which is 500-meter gap to the west from where all foreign invasions came into Russia, be it Napoleon, be it Hitler. And if you look at Belarus and Ukraine, it is at the heart of that entire matrix. And therefore, the defense of Belarus and Ukraine becomes actually an existential strategic imperative for Russia. Now, these are two major dilemmas which play in their strategic security calculus. And now imagine that if people are trying to squeeze Russia after one balkanization has already taken place, and you are ushering a series of color revolution on one side, bringing about a political re-engineering of the neighborhood, and on the other side, you're expanding NATO from 14 countries to about 30 plus countries, and you want to nibble Ukraine and Belarus and deploy NATO weapons there, as it is there just about 300 meters from St. Petersburg. Obviously, you're overstepping and overstepping Russian red lines. Even if Putin was not there and there was any other ruler, probably he would have behaved in a similar manner because this is an existential threat for them. So therefore, Americans never heeded Russian red lines. And that experience was the assurances they made to them at the time of balkanization of Russia, fragmentation of Russia. Then in 2008 in Bucharest Accord, which was made, and when they wanted Ukraine to join NATO. Subsequently in 2014, when they actually engineered that uprising in Ukraine in Maidan, and 2020 they wanted to put Ukraine in the accelerated list of joining the NATO membership. Now, every time a Russian red line was crossed, Russians resorted to a military option. 2008, when they wanted Ukraine to join NATO, they went and they attacked Abkhazia and South Ossetia. 2014 Maidan uprising took place. They entered Crimea and they went into Donbass and this thing. What is that Americans would have thought in these 10 years that Russia would not behave in a similar manner if you are trying to talk about expansion of NATO all over again? And that is exactly what happened. Then they've been rubbing the salt to the Russian pride, which is very profound, by imposing economic sanctions and subjecting to them to different kind of strategic coercion from time to time. So this is what has actually led. They also failed to carry out a psychoanalysis of Russian population and Russian leadership, that if they are pushed against a wall, how this leadership and this nation is likely to behave. And that is why there have been miscalculations from both sides, and you see a full-fledged war which is unfurling. Now, the other lesson that we have to take from this is that we cannot take a benign view of the world. If you read Lee Kuan Yew, who was the father of Singapore, he said state behavior is guided by social Darwinism. Social Darwinism means you have your national interest, there is a hierarchy of power, and there is a balance of power in which military will play an important role. And this is exactly what is happening in this part, because there is a contestation of power. You know, this geopolitics of contestation today is manifest in contestation over ideologies. That means the parallel system, resources, location, trade, technology. And now it is spanning out to the other strategic frontiers like outer space, cognitive space, you call Arctic region, cyberspace. These are the new strategic frontiers of war fighting which we'll have to take into consideration. Then another aspect which is very, very important is the geopolitics of alliances, which this war has taught us. That basically, if you put it in an overall conceptual framework, the nations either they bind if they are weak, or they balance, or they hedge and align. Now this became a tipping point in the geopolitical alliance, and what today we are seeing, two strange bedfellows coming together, that is Russia and China. And in February 4, they made a declaration that our partnership has no limits. Virtually, Americans have pushed two strange guys who are actually diametrically, or they had certain fundamental contradictions in their relations. They brought them together, which is a failure of grand strategy as far as United States is concerned. The second thing is the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, which was actually having tremors, and it was very weak. This war has brought this, even if temporarily, the Euro-Atlantic Alliance together. Certain changes are taking place in the Indo-Pacific, where Americans have a very robust alliance system, and they are trying to link up now developments in Euro-Atlantic space, strategic space, with what you call is the Indo-Pacific space, and that justifies the presence of South Korea, Australia, and Japan in the Madrid NATO summit. So they're trying to create a kind of a replica of NATO in maybe in the Indo-Pacific in the garb of something else. AUKUS has already come up there. So this is another thing. Now in this whole milieu, the middle level powers, the small powers are on the horns of dilemma because you don't want to take sides. Your security interests are intertwined with one side, your economic interests are intertwined with one side. So what do? You align and realign. But the good outcome out of this is that the position that our country has taken of strategic autonomy, and today we have virtually become the champions or the voice of global South, which has always been a sufferer. And now that we have this, chairmanship or the presidency over G20 and Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think it's a wonderful opportunity for India, given the strategic circumstances in which this geopolitical churning is taking place, for us to position ourselves and champion the cause of global South. Another very important lesson we've been talking about loosely, hybrid warfare, gray zone conflicts, and blah, blah, blah. Now, this is a classic case of multi-domain warfare, what we are seeing here. And domains here are political, economic, diplomatic, technological, cognitive. And there are multitude of means which are being used by states. These are state, non-state, military, non-military, linear, non-linear. And it has actually blurred the lines between classic military campaign and gray zone conflicts. You don't know whether you're at war or you're not at war. And this actually imposes a security dilemmas on nation states, how to react. There are no clear-cut choices. If you act, you escalate. If you do not act, you face an embarrassment. And this is exactly what is happening. And I think in our own context, this hybrid warfare, multi-domain warfare, how it is going to manifest in Indian context, we need to have a de novo look in the light of lessons that we learned from Ukraine. Now here, at the low end of the spectrum, you have Pakistan, which has mastered in asymmetric warfare, cross-border terrorism. At the high end of the spectrum, you have China, which is investing hugely in disruptive and niche technologies. How these two are combined, how these scenarios manifest, we'll have to take a call on this and see how we need to actually revisit India's overall strategy, structures, systems, and skills. And how do you take whole of government approach, because we still work in silos, and there's very little synergy still in the instruments of national power. And why not only that? How do you adopt a whole of nation approach? And when I say whole of nation approach, Ukraine is a classic example where every citizen, whether he was on the soil of Ukraine or outside, he became a warrior. They were working in underground cells, they were putting concoctions of these drones, micro drones, everybody with little bit of training on stingers and javelin missiles. He became a soldier. Now in our context, you have NCC there, you have home guards there. Most of these organizations are underutilized. Tomorrow, if chips are down, how are you going to mobilize some of these agencies, and how do you train these agencies is a major lesson for us. Now, other thing I think we've talked about, role of private players, Starlink, the whole savior of entire command control, It was Elon Musk who became the custodian of command control communication system of Ukraine. But for him, I think Russians would have paralyzed the entire system. So we got to recognize that. Other things about tank, PGM, space, counter space, artillery, everything has been talked about. What I liked about General Bakshi's book is when he talked about nuclear factor, he's put a lot of stress on weapons of mass destruction, biological warfare and chemical warfare. And you see, there have been so many dozens of American, German biological factories which are operating in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, which can be used, and they've been studying these pathogens which can be unleashed. Likewise, the chemical warfare facilities. You see, there were these laboratories which Russians were talking about. Very recently, when I was in Russia, in Moscow, they were talking about these dirty bombs, or the using weapons of mass destruction as terror weapons, and then there is no attributability. In our case, we have an adversary with a jihadi outfit, day in and day out, flexing his nuclear muscle. We got to look at how do we prepare ourselves for this dirty warfare, the nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, which has actually gone out of our teaching and been pushed to the background. That's another issue. Now, one more important aspect here is role of non-state actors. You see, there are foreign legions which are operating in Ukraine, all from all over the world, and you have a Wagner group which with its experience from Chechnya, from Syria, they've come and actually they're undertaking a lot of special operations. Now you take this across to our adversary on the other side. It's a copy book that you have very high terrain friction in Pakistan, you have very dense population, you have built up areas, and you have an ecosystem of terrorist groups, everybody. Suppose all these are molded together. What is the kind of resistance that our ground forces are likely to face? Are our present military operational plans geared up to fight in this kind of a milieu? Or we need to really have a relook at our strategy, at our structures, and at our weapon system? Is a debate by itself. Then how do you deal with civil population? You see, this war has caused untold misery on civil population. There are about 10 million refugees within and outside the country put together. Humanitarian corridors had to be created. There are large number of, collateral casualties. Then people are getting quarantined without electricity, water. If you have to go to a foreign country and you have to sort of operate, are our military structures and civil agencies geared up? Or you actually then start, getting a lot of blame from human rights organizations being the oppressors and then war crimes and things like that. So we have to have a relook at that. Then this actually has further reinforced the need for diversification of technology because 64% of our dependency is still on Russians. Energy, diversification of energy resources, diversification of your supply chain, decoupling of economy, how much to decouple, how much to integrate is a major lesson, and to that extent I think it is the responsibility of every Indian to see that this Atmanirbhar Bharat initiative in our country becomes a success so that we are not strategically vulnerable to coercion by country A, B or C. Of course, strategic communication is very, very important lesson that has emerged. It's a battle of narratives. Russians may have gained much more on ground, but in the public mind, it is actually Ukrainians and the West which is winning. Why? Because they have a very well-structured system of playing out their narratives. In the Indian context, even if on ground we've been making very good progress in having good results, but our narratives are very weak. You see what happened during Balakot, Uri, many other incidents, even on Kashmir issue for that matter. Because in Pakistan there is DGISPR, an agency which is empowered to do. In China there is a public works department. Here who is in control? Social media, your media, electronic media channels, your print, everybody is actually moving in different directions. And there is no overarching agency there to actually fabricate, propagate, and promote an Indian narrative. So this is another lesson that we need to think. Last thing here, two more things I want to say. One is, failure of strategic intelligence. Russians were not able to fathom or correctly assess the magnitude of resistance that they are likely to encounter from Ukrainians. For 10 years, something was going on there. CIA was doing something. They were training them. They were equipping them. These people thought it's going to be a cakewalk. And when you have an authoritarian regime and that regime only wants to, believe what it wants to hear, then the whole information system gets filtered in a manner that you don't get the correct picture. As a result, they were not able to gauge, they over-calculated, they miscalculated, and they were thinking it's going to be a cakewalk. They will go to capture Kyiv through these airhead operations with multi-pronged offensive, bring about a political capitulation, and you will have a new regime, and their military will get totally, fragmented, and we'll have a victory. But that has not happened, and we should also draw certain lessons out of that. How do we strengthen our strategic intelligence? Last point that I want to bring about here in the Indian Army context. Very recently, we have this Agni Veer, scheme. You have some theaterization going to and fro, sometime 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. We are an operational armed forces, right? Here, we do not have the leeway and the bandwidth for experimentation. Everything that we decide, whether it is your theaterization, whether it is introducing a new scheme of recruitment, it requires very careful thought, it requires deliberation, we need to do certain pilot projects, then only introduce at a large scale, otherwise we'll have more messy situations than actually healthy outcomes. Finally, let me tell you, how do you sort of crystal gaze what is happening there on ground? And maybe that is what would be probably a revised version of General Bakshi's book, because there will have to be a revised, addition to this. Now, as we stand today, I think we should not look at this Ukrainian campaign strictly in zero-sum game. Foolishly, Westerns are trying to score a victory for Ukraine. That country is in shambles. Everything is destroyed. It will take decades and decades and decades for rebuilding that country and have some semblance of order there. Now, what is happening is, at this juncture, when there were 3 phases of Russian campaign. The phase 1, maximalist, which has failed. Then they went for pivot to east, Donbass, and the east southern region and your Luhansk. That has also not succeeded fully, because the moment they went on the other side of Dnieper River, they were not able to sustain. So they realized that they are become very tenuous. Their lines of communication, lines of logistics became very tenuous. Winter is setting in, so they will have some very embarrassing situations. So they have done a very deliberate thing by coming this side of this Dnieper River. Now they have multiple layers at General Bakshi of defenses here. No way, no matter how much Americans of the West is going to help, Ukrainians will not be able to dislodge Russians from this defense line. As a result, as long as Russians are able to secure this 15% of this territory, they have already done referendum and it's a de facto independent part of Russia now. They said if you attack it, well, you will invoke a nuclear risk. They have control over Sea of Azov and Black Sea, and they are controlling all the trade. 95% of the grains of Ukraine go through the seas. So they have control over the seas. They have Kerch land bridge coming into this region. If they are able to secure these military objectives, which they are quite capable, I think they have if not full, they have nearly about 80% of victory already secured. So Americans are now also gravitating towards that line, and that's why, some kind of a back channel diplomacy is taking place, so that you accept this as a de facto, ceasefire line, and then look at certain ways or means of having a new modus vivendi, so that you're able to bring this campaign to some dignified halt. Now, how things pan out, it's not going to be an easy task. It will take another 2 to 3 years for things to pan out, and I think that will give enough gin for General Bakshi to revise his book. So finally, I just say that as far as India is concerned, there are 2 major lessons we have to draw from this. Paulo Coelho, I read him very, very carefully. He said, love thy neighbor, but never sell your sword. And what, this fellow, what is his name? Roosevelt. He said, speak softly, but carry a big stick and you will go far. These are the mantras for India as an independent, buoyant, confident, but responsible nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.